Welcome to another edition of CJI Unpacked, and this time we're going to talk about the community safety and local policing arrangements in Northern Ireland, including a follow-up review of the 2019 CJI report on policing and community safety partnerships. So we have with us today Michael McAvoy, who's the Deputy Director of Safer Communities Directorate, Assistant Chief Constable Bobby Singleton, who's the Police Service of Northern Ireland Lead for Local Policing and Community Engagement, and Dr. Claire Feehan from CJI, who led this inspection. So Claire, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us why this inspection and follow-up review was carried out?
Okay, so this was an opportunity really to look at a very important topic, community safety, something which affects everybody across Northern Ireland. It was an opportunity to pull in an inspection of neighbourhood policing specifically, where this has been a very topical issue over the last number of years, and it's an opportunity to look at how that is performing and progressing within the PSNI, and then also, as you'd mentioned, to look at PCSPs and their role, and specifically in how they have progressed and the recommendations that were made in 2019.
Michael, when we talk about community safety, what do we mean by community safety, and how important is it to have confidence in the criminal justice system?
Jacqui, honestly, I think it's pretty fundamental. I mean, community safety is a building block of society. It really does go to the heart of how each of us feel in our homes, going to and from work, and we're out socialising. Listen, we can produce all the stats we want as an evidence base for how crime is going down, but if that's not your lived experience, or that's not how you feel where you live, doesn't matter. Now, I have to say to you, community safety, it's a pretty nebulous term as well. It means different things to different people. And I always see that as an opportunity, because it opens a conversation. And clearly, the report recommendation suggests that the Department of Justice should bring forward a new community safety strategy. It's a recommendation we welcome, and we genuinely, as a staff team, look forward to starting work on that.
So, what sort of challenges do you think there'll be in taking that forward, Michael? Because certainly we've seen through the report that it's a very broad landscape and lots of different people and organisations involved in that.
And that's it. You can't. There's no one department or agency, the police, can't improve community safety in isolation. It requires a partnership approach. It requires a lot of people talking to one another, working together, moving out of their silos, and recognising that each of us have a contribution to make to improving community safety, tackling antisocial behaviour, and increasing confidence in police. And if we improve community safety, police confidence will be lifted. It was genuinely interesting that the report was a bit of a double header. It focused on community safety and local policing. I thought that was really helpful, because the two things read in conjunction, they do go together. I mean, from experience, talk to the public about community safety and how you feel. You don't get too far into the conversation before all of a sudden you're talking about the need for more police officers on the beat. Like, listen, I'm sure that's part of the solution, but it's not all of the solution. But it's always insightful that that's often how people think about how their community safety could be improved. So I'd say it's a good conversation starter, simply asking people, what does community safety mean to them? Then we talk about local policing. Then we talk about how all these things are interrelated, and the conversation goes from there.
So we're lucky we have an assembly back. We've got a Minister of Justice and we have other ministers in place now. How much of an appetite do you think there is? There's 3 years left in this mandate. Do you think there is an appetite in those statutory organisations, never mind the wider voluntary community sector organisations and others, to get together to do that?
I've no doubt. Listen, we're not too far into the conversation. I'm going to mention money. That has been a hindrance for a number of years across the justice family. And I don't want to bore everyone with quoting stats, but something that struck me recently was something the Minister said. She was talking about how, since the evolution of policing and justice, whilst the block grant, that funding mechanism that funds all the work across the public sector has risen by 43%. In the Department of Justice, it's 3%. That clearly has had a material effect on our ability to deliver the public service that we do. And that's not breaking out the violins and simply, it's just a statement of fact. It has affected the police, and perhaps the public consciousness about that focuses primarily on police numbers. Good, fine, it should. But it has been an inhibiting factor, and it will continue to be, I imagine, going forward. But it does actually drive the conversations across departments and agencies about the importance of collaboration. So there are challenges that remain, but you asked about the ambition. Undoubtedly, Minister Long will be enthusiastic as we embark on this work, but to also be realistic, because, as a civil servant, you just look around you and there are vacancies everywhere. It's probably how we've been making the budget work in recent years. So there are some resourcing pressures, but this is not the time to rehearse those. Genuinely, the fundamentals of the recommendations are sound, and we look forward to implementing it.
So, Bobby, I want to bring you in here now, and I think one of the useful things in the report was about unpacking some of that information about what was local policing and what was neighbourhood policing. So can you tell us why neighbourhood officers are so important in policing local communities?
Well, I think for us it probably goes back to Patton as well, and this isn't just about the what of policing. So that's, I think, reasonably well understood in terms of keeping people safe, and we've talked about community safety. But fundamentally, neighbourhood policing is about the how, and it's about a style of policing as well as fulfilling the statutory obligations. It's about going about it in a manner that engages and involves communities and partners in that kind of co-delivery of community safety. And neighbourhood policing in particular is absolutely fundamental, because it's the touch point with communities more often than not, and in fact with kind of frontline partners and service delivery. So it's a fundamental element of policing with the community, which was Patton's vision. I want to say that I'm really grateful to you and the inspection team for carrying out this inspection. For us, it's really timely, and actually I think really very helpful in terms of what I would describe as being the crossroads that policing is currently at. In fact, if we haven't already crossed the crossroads some time ago, we certainly weren't surprised by the findings. And in many ways, actually, as I say, it's helpful because it gives us a bit of an evidence base to understand, let's say, first of all, and importantly, recognise the contribution that neighbourhood officers as individuals and teams have made. I'm really pleased to see that in your comments in particular, but reflecting what the inspection heard from community groups and stakeholders, because it's been a really tough time for officers in policing, and I think to see that recognition, I would hope will re-energise them to some extent. But of course, Michael's touched on it. The funding and resourcing issue is road large for us, and actually a lot of work over the last 2 years with a lot of budget uncertainty to try and continue to deliver the best possible service that we can against that backdrop. And one of the questions that we've been asked is, with these kind of budgetary challenges, what will the impacts be? And actually, I think the report sounds, for me anyway, a bit of a warning of sorts in terms of capturing what I would describe as almost the opportunity cost that we have that maybe doesn't show up on the balance sheet, but where we have neighbourhood teams being abstracted. I know you described it as the key defining contextual feature within the report was this issue of abstractions. So actually finding that evidence and providing that back, I think, is really, really helpful to us. And I think it should be informative in terms of the conversations that now need to go on around what a future policing budget looks like, because I do feel that we are at a bit of a crossroads, and there's a choice here about the how and what our policing service looks like going forward. And I think this report can feed into that discussion.
Well, it's maybe not a fair question, but I'll ask it anyway. Have you any sense of where neighbourhood policing will land in terms of agreeing what the priorities are for the next policing budget?
Well, to some extent, the budget will determine how much neighbourhood policing we can do alongside other priorities. We want to be a community-based and focused policing service. We want to be delivering policing with the community, but it will come down to what we can afford, collectively as a society to do. We will do what we can to protect the neighbourhood policing function, but you can see evidence, I think, within this report that we are in danger of having neighbourhood policing in name only, because if neighbourhood policing continues to be a department of everything as we try to fulfill our obligations to provide an efficient policing service, then there will undoubtedly be pressures in terms of the delivery of that. But, I hope that we get a budget settlement that will allow us to strike the right balance in that.
So I think it's important for me to say our reports are about as much as providing assurance and pointing up good practice, as well as making recommendations. And Claire, one of the features running through this report was about the positive feedback that you heard about neighbourhood police officers. So is there something else you'd like to add about what you heard from people that you interviewed?
I guess we heard very strongly pretty much from every community group, and we spoke to community groups across Northern Ireland in a number of different districts. We heard unanimous support across the board for policing in general, but particularly for their neighbourhood officers. They were very grateful for their neighbourhood officers, and then when we spoke to neighbourhood officers themselves, the dedication that they had for the communities that they served was evident throughout the entire time. And there was concern from neighbourhood officers about the abstraction issue and the impact that was having. They were frustrated that they weren't able to really fulfil that role to their fullest potential that they wanted to do. And there was concern from communities as well, about what that would mean and the breakdown of those relationships. So it was, that value piece was really strongly felt across the board.
And something that we've mentioned in the report, and I've put in the forward around not losing the ground gained, that it's been a long time since Padden, and probably Northern Ireland isn't in as good a shape as we hoped it would be by this stage. And we know there are difficulties, particularly in some communities, about providing that neighbourhood policing presence. But I think it's important that we continue on that journey. I want to get into talk a little bit about the PCSPs and why include the PCSP follow-up review in this inspection, Claire.
Well, I'm sure Michael will want to jump in as well. PCSPs are a key part of the community safety landscape in Northern Ireland. They do a lot of the delivery work out there. So we felt it was really important to include them as part of the wider inspection. But given we had done an inspection in 2019, it was a great opportunity to revisit that, to see what progress had been made and maybe where there were areas where there was progress still needed.
So Michael, how do we ensure, I'm going to ask Bobby the same question, but how do we ensure that PCSPs are as effective as they possibly can be?
It's a continuous conversation. It's a journey, but I think we need to go back to what are PCSPs and what are they there to do. Fundamentally, they're there. They are a structure, and there's one in each of the district councils. So they're local, they're place-based. The membership is drawn from elected members in that district, from members of the public who step forward and volunteer as independent members. And then there are representatives from each of 7 statutory organisations: the police, housing executive, EA, fire and rescue service, other colleagues from. So the structure, I think, fundamentally is a sound one. It puts a focus on local policing, local improvement of community safety, tackling antisocial behaviour, and increasing confidence in police. I've just literally, expressed in 3 phrases the sum total of the work that the PCSPs do. They're different. They work off a sort of strategic review every 3 years, and then an action plan that they bring forward each year. That's deliberately designed to enable them at a local level to express their priorities and then to move where they put the focus of their energy, their effort. Between the policing board and ourselves, and they are jointly funded, we invest £4.5 million per year in the PCSPs. Now, when you break that down, everything from £250,000 to £828,000 for somewhere like Belfast, it's not a lot of money, but typically the investment in PCSPs doubles up on that sort of multiplier effect of what they draw in to the work that they do. It is a partnership fundamentally. It operates as a partnership, elected independent statutory reps, and it seeks to develop interventions to meet local needs. So they really are eyes and ears on the ground. The structure works for us in terms of having a mechanism through we can have a conversation about what the pertinent issues. Crime types change, the focus changes. When we wrote our last community safety strategy, no one was talking about cybercrime. Nobody was talking about vapes or their use as an entry-level drug through the consumption of splice. So things move on, and the PCSPs are that constant for us on a locality basis. Working with the district commander plays a key role in each of the PCSPs, not to diminish the role that other statutory agencies and partners play, but there's a relationship there. And bear in mind that they grew out of the district policing partnerships of a number of years ago, and used to be 26 of those. We had the old council structures. And I think, to be fair, they probably started out with that sort of idea of local people holding the police to account locally. still an element of that, and that's what they're there for, similar to Singleton and the Department of Justice. But it's moved on from that. It is a partnership, it is a collaboration, and it's about finding local solutions to local problems. So I think the structure fundamentally is sound, and how we make them more effective. Listen, we've introduced outcome-based accountability in terms of how we assess the progress of the action plans. At a fundamental level, we would be here all day if I started to cite the best examples that come off the top of my head in terms of the innovation at local level. But fundamentally, it's typically a local response to a particular knotty local problem that stands out. And PCSPs do that year in, year out, and they move and flex. And they're a great testing bed for innovation. Things like support hubs and participatory budgeting, because they're constant, because they have some resource, they can often trial that, tweak that, and community safety warden schemes that exist, and other innovative approaches to meet particular local needs. A focus on issues such as road safety in rural areas sometimes has more prominence than it would in an urban area for obvious reasons. So the local structure, the local action planning format of PCSPs, I think works fundamentally, but it's a constant challenge to keep it fresh and keep it relevant. But there is a challenge in your report around how we measure the effectiveness, which we accept. Yeah.
And from a policing perspective, Bobby, what would you?
Well, I think it's about collectively continually challenging ourselves just around trying to make sure that we're in particular sharing and kind of co-opting best practice across the partnerships. We've got a massive role to play in that in terms of the kind of internal network that we have between the district commanders. We also work very closely now with the Northern Ireland Policing Board, and one of the things we've introduced in the last couple of years is our problem solving awards. And again, the work of local teams with PCSPs is a really good mechanism for kind of highlighting the really good work, also making sure that it's rewarded and recognised, and you get that platform to try and spread the good practice. The other thing for me, though, is just around challenging the outreach and engagement that takes place through PCSPs. Again, that's something that we've made a significant investment in ourselves, and some of the learning from that, I think we expect now to be cascaded through the districts to support the PCSPs in terms of better outreach to communities, to make sure that they are focused on the genuine issues of local concern and need, and that the responses are developed in conjunction with communities. So yeah, I think there's a more evidence-based approach which can be taken across the board to kind of raise everybody's boats collectively.
So you've got a number of recommendations collectively and individually to take forward. So how's that going to happen?
Yeah, so we're accepting all of our recommendations. You'll be glad to hear. Again, I think the recommendations were, I think they're proportionate as well to the issues. Sometimes, we would have a concern with inspection bodies that you can end up with unrealistic recommendations, even in terms of affordability. There's nothing in this report that we're not happy to accept. We think they're really common sense steps that we can take in order to improve the 6 areas that you've identified for us. So we have a neighbourhood delivery board, which has been sitting for some time, which has already taken the draft actions and will now seek to address them again within the timescales that have been identified. I don't think there's anything in there in terms of the specifics that's going to be dependent on whatever the financial kind of situation is for policing. I think they're all readily addressable. So we'll pick those up and we'll start to work on them. Many of them, in fact, we had actually already started work on, or we're thinking along the same line. So I think that's really helpful as well.
Does anybody want to say that the strategic recommendation is pretty straightforward? Go and bring forward through co-design, public consultation, a fully fledged community safety strategy. But it's not just that. The report has, in many ways, Jenny has told us how you would like us to do that, and the areas that we should concentrate on, the level of community engagement to ensure that it's grounded in an up-to-date contemporary review of community safety. So there is a bit of a how-to guide alongside that big recommendation, which we genuinely appreciate, and it's a helpful start. Resources are a problem. I'm sorry to come back to that. The Minister, will seek to manage expectations about whether or not we can do this in 1 year from publication date. But that's the aspiration, if we can get the resource. And again, the comment the Minister made was She wanted to do justice to the recommendation. That requires us to find a resource and have a dedicated resource so that we do it in an expeditious way. Because we try and bolt it on to business as usual, it's not going to work. It's not going to resonate with the public. It really does have to be a dedicated piece of work over what is 12 months seems like a long time, but in this space, it's a relatively short period of time. So we're looking forward to getting started. Something Bobby said about neighbourhood policing, and we could come back to, Bobby, when we talk to policing and community safety partnerships, they're chaired by councillors. The independent members rotate in terms of the vice chairs. Again, they're very connected to local communities. We hear, and I've been in this department 7 years, but I've been through probably 2 cycles at least of hearing how good the investment in neighbourhood policing is, and then the disappointment that resources are being put in from neighbourhood policing and relationships are having to be built again, and then a reinvestment in neighbourhood policing has occurred in recent years and it's under pressure. We've heard that. It's frustrating for communities, for elected representatives, but it's frustrating for ourselves because we see the connection between PCSPs and neighbourhood policing is fundamental to improve community safety, tackle ASB, and increase confidence in policing at a local level. So it's just an additional point to kind of back up what Bobby was saying.
I would imagine frustrating for senior officers as well, because as the report has shown, not so much at the operational level, but certainly at senior levels where there is that churn in senior officers. But it must be difficult for them too when they've invested in building up that network and those relationships, and then they're moving on to something else as well.
Yeah, I mean, we do now try as much as possible to make sure that we've got effective succession planning, and equally, so when it comes to new appointments, we will always now try and look and put the needs of the community first to try and guarantee some kind of continuity. Then secondly comes the needs of the organisation, and thirdly, the individual. So yeah, it is a frustration, and I feel like to some extent we've never really recovered, if you like, in a sense, from the kinetic forces that were unleashed with the patent reforms. It's meant that within this organisation in particular, there's been really unprecedented levels of churn. I shouldn't complain too much because I've probably done all right from it, but no, it is a big frustration for communities, and there's no doubt it at times it does set us back, but we've heard that very clearly from the community as well, and we do now try as best as we possibly can, balancing those potentially competing interests to try and make sure that the relationships, as much as anything else, are maintained, because it's all about trying to move things forward.
I think I mentioned earlier, Michael, about it being a crowded space and lots of different organisations involved, whether that's involved in community sector, statutory sector, and something that we would find is that people lack that clarity about who's getting money from where for what. So in a more challenging fiscal environment, then all the more reason is supposed to have a bit more clarity and transparency about where money is going and who's getting it and for what.
Well, there's a recommendation in the report about us through the Community Safety Network carrying out a review of the Community Safety Fora that exists out there. That's a really helpful recommendation, and it's again something that we're keen to do, something that we'd started with ASB Fora, which has been around for quite a long time, but that space has grown and developed. It's also complicated sometimes. Funding pots created in government departments can drive some of that schism and that duplication, shouldn't, because we have a system where we should be identifying displacement and duplication, but it doesn't always work, to be honest. So that's how we've ended up with this crowded field, and part of the analysis that will also inform the community safety strategies, that review of community safety fora. But you reminded me, I've probably worked with you. You've been at 3 different grades since I first came across you. So it's not as hard for me and people in government departments to work with the police. The fact that the district commander in East Antrim moves to be the chief superintendent in Derry Strabane, that's fine, because I've known that person in one role. But at a local level, it drives great frustration, as Claire and others have heard, and you know well. So,
well, can I thank you not only for participating today in the podcast, but also to your staff and officers and staff in the department that we've engaged with. I'm sure, Claire,
it's been great to work with you, at this time. Yeah, strive to work together rather than going off on solo runs. So I appreciate your time.
And that's it. I think we're all in the same space. It is about better services and continuous improvement, and it's such an important topic. I've no doubt that we'll be returning to it again in a future inspection programme. The next episode of CJI Unpacked is on the implementation of the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act Northern Ireland 2021 and CJI's review report.